One of our subscribers asked, can you make a video on judging color values? Everyone wants to explain values in terms of a black and white scale, and we all know about those, which I don't find helpful in the real world. Well, here's my take on that. I've never thought it very practical to think of values in terms of numbers anyway, although I use that language sometimes in talking about values. But it's really more meaningful in the real world, especially when we're out plein air painting. It's more meaningful if we can use a comparative method for reading values of colors. Now here's what I'm talking about. So if you can, first of all, when you look at the real world, find the areas that are in shadow. Now sometimes that's hard for people to do, to recognize exactly what's in shadow. But if you can build that skill first, you're halfway there. Because if the area is in shadow, then it's in a very narrow value range. So if you begin there, now that is when there's a direct light. If there's diffused light, you're still going to have some shadows where the light is being blocked. Let me say it that way. So you can always do that. But let's just start right there with that one premise. If you can determine what's in shadow, all right, from that point, what is the darkest value you see? And as I said, this is going to be comparative. So what is the darkest value you see? And if I'm looking at these chickens, which we've used in a previous quick tip, or this rooster, or whatever, what is the darkest value I see? And so if he said read color values, well, even if I were looking at just this part of that rooster, what is the darkest value I see? Well, the darkest value I see is this value right here, and you can see that is in shadow. Then I could ask myself, what is the lightest value I see? Well, let's start here first. What is the darkest value I see? And can I match that value? Now, one really good system for doing that, for matching value, is you can just take simple sheets of paper. And you can do it this way. You say, okay, what is the darkest value I see right here? I can tell it's very dark. Maybe it's not the darkest dark that exists. Maybe this, even this would be black, would be the darkest dark that exists, perhaps. But it's a little lighter than that. So now you're using a little bit of comparative language. And from that point, you would begin to mix towards that value. So now let's see. I say it's a little bit lighter than black. So if I see that that's sort of in a reddish green, and the viewer didn't ask about mixing colors, just about mixing the values. And so you could, whatever you read the color to be, then let's put this just a little bit more like this. Then if you put a little sample right here and hold it up to here, close one eye. And if I hold that up and I just say they seem to be in the same value, I can do the same thing out in the real world. If I spot a value and I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at, I can isolate that value. I can just begin mixing anything, and then ask yourself what you need to add to it. Make a little bit of a sampling on the edge, right on the edge of a piece of paper, anything. Hold it up, close one eye, compare. Is my paint darker than what I'm looking at, or is it lighter than what I'm looking at? If it's darker, that means I need to add more dark. If it's lighter, that means I need to add more light. So that's one of the best ways to read that. Now, another way to think about the whole issue of value is to compare the thing that you're looking at. If it's the rooster, compare the darkest value you're looking at to the lightest value you're looking at. So if this is the darkest value, and I'm just going to put this right here just as value splotch, now that we have discovered that is pretty much the same value as that darkest dark I'm looking at. So you're not looking at color here necessarily. Well, you're not looking at hue, and you're not really looking at the intensity, you're simply looking at value. So if I'm saying, all right, that's the darkest value, what is the lightest value I'm looking at? Now, if I'm looking at the whole rooster, probably if I squint, close one eye and squint the other one, that helps to block details out so you can see value better. I see right here as being the lightest value of that. So that appears to be in the red. Let's find out. So if I can mix a little bit of a red in a light value, and it is not in shadow. It has light shining on it. So if I can mix a little bit of that, and right on my same piece of paper here, right on the edge, I can compare those two and say, no, I'm a little dark. That means I need to add light. And I could add a little bit of yellow to that. Now let's see. Do I have it? Do I have that value yet? So now I can go on the other side of the piece of paper and squint and say, no, I made it too light. You see, you don't have to get uptight about it. You just experiment by trial and error. And so I can add a little bit. Now see how much too light. It's needs to add another little bit of that red to that, make it a little bit darker. Now I can put this same place and hold that up, and I'm getting closer. So I adjust it. If it needs to be lighter, I make it lighter. If it needs to be a little redder, I make it a little redder. And now let's see what we have. Now if you squint, you see it's pretty much in the same value area. Now one thing I can do at this point is to compare those two together. The lightest light with the darkest dark. So I'm holding this up here. I see this is very light, this is very dark, this is very light. So I know then if that's the lightest light I'm looking at and this is the darkest dark, then these are going to be somewhere in between that in value. So let's look at that just a little bit longer. This is the darkest dark right here. Well, I want to make this lightest, put the lightest light there too. Now this is the lightest light right there. Now we have the darkest dark and the lightest light. It will be a lot easier to look at the other values of the other colors in comparison. So if we think of in shadow, not in shadow, what's in shadow, what's not in shadow. There's not really a bright light shining on that. It's kind of a subdued light, but we can see that this area right in here seems to be kind of in between light and shadow. So we can look at this area right in here. What value is that? All right, we know it's not this dark. We know it's not this light. So what we can reach for is something in between. And so then I might go into a red here. I might add a yellow to the red. And I'm looking for a value that is in between. And another way to do that is simply, if you're working from a photograph, is simply to hold your brush up in next to it. Now you see, as I squint, I can see that mixture I have in the brush is a little bit too dark. So that's the way you compare it. That's the way you read values, is comparative. Is it too dark? Is it too light? Now let's see, that's just about right. I can then do a real comparison. It needs to be a little bit more yellow, I think. Not that that matters a whole lot, but that you can also do the hue that way by saying, does it need to be more yellow, does it need to be more red, but we're talking about values. Now we can see that is a bit too light. If it's a bit too light, I add the dark to it, back to it. And let's try that. Right on the edge, and that, all right, I made it a little too dark. That means I add just a little bit more of the yellow and pull it back, a little bit more of the lighter color and pull it back, and there we have it right there. And this is the value we're looking at. So that will teach you to use that method of comparison, comparing one value to another, not just trying to hit a single value that you're looking at, but compare one value to another and be willing to work, play with this process of mixing and trying to match values the way you saw me doing it here. The more experience you have in the actual mixing and matching of values, the easier it becomes, and the easier it becomes to see when you're looking at a value, to see exactly what value you're looking at. So I suggest that you get to work and do lots and lots and lots of value comparison, mixing paint and matching values that you see, comparing one value to another, which is darker, which is lighter. And then when you make your mixture, does it need to be darker, does it need to be lighter? So use that comparison method, and I think that you'll find that working with values and being able to interpret values will become a whole lot easier for you. Go on over to DianeMize.com. You'll find lots and lots of video lessons on values and reading colors and that sort of thing, variations on working with values. You might find those helpful too. And if you have a quick tip you'd like for us to do, leave us a message right down here and we'll put your suggestion on the schedule. And there's your quick tip.